Welcome back to Case of Interest Kohberger. I'm Newswatch 16, Stacey Lang. Well, if you were watching our coverage, you know this already, but Bryan Kohberger has pled guilty to the Idaho college murders, admitting guilt in a hearing in a courtroom in Boise, Idaho on July 2nd. And it was a pretty explosive hearing. We have a lot of details to talk about. And a lot of new information that would have been demonstrated at trial. I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that, we heard Bryan Kohberger's voice for the first time in this hearing, mostly answering yes or no questions. If you've ever been in a guilty plea hearing before, there's pretty standard questions asking him if he's competent, if he is of clear mind and making this decision of his own free will. All of which he answered as he should have, and the judge accepting that guilty plea. He accepted it, though, after opening up the hearing by admonishing the efforts of, led mostly by particularly one victim's family, but also, a lot of people who have followed this case closely and feel very passionately and strongly about it, and that's fine. But he admonished them for make calls to the judge's office to try and influence him to not accept this plea deal. And he acknowledged that they had received a barrage of calls and that it was, I think his quote was, it was extraordinarily disruptive for his staff. And he said it would have been appropriate for him to consider those calls, so he did not listen to any of them. We knew going into this that there were some on the victim's side very upset about this plea deal, that it was happening at all, and that the prosecution was not going to go to trial and pursue the death penalty in this case. And again, the details of that plea deal were that Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty to all of the charges against him. There were 5 charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. And he accepted life sentences for all 4 of the murder charges and a 10-year sentence on the burglary charge. That will be formally made his sentence at a sentencing hearing that we now know is set for July 23rd in that same courtroom in Boise, Idaho, in front of Judge Hippler. And we will have coverage of that hearing when it comes. I thought the most significant information coming out of this hearing, though, came from the Latah County prosecutor, Bill Thompson, who would have tried this case if it went to trial and has been at the forefront of this case from day one. He stood up and he presented in a narrative, kind of like an opening argument would have been, all of the evidence, an overview of all of the evidence, I should say, that they would have presented the case against Bryan Kohberger. And there were a lot of things that we already knew that were presented in the affidavit of probable cause when he was first arrested in December of 2022. And there also were some new details and some confirmation that there are some details we will never get because only Bryan Kohberger knows the answer to them. And he is not required to share any of that information. He still could. And we can only hope that he will one day share it. But there are still some questions out there. So I wanted to take a quick look at my notes from Bill Thompson's statement. He said, and I believe this was new information, that really their narrative begins in March of 2022, almost a whole year before the murders, and that is when Bryan Kohberger purchased the K-Bar knife on Amazon using an Amazon gift card, bought the knife and the knife sheath from Amazon. Then in June of 2022, that is the first time, I'm sorry, not June. June is when he moved to Pullman, Washington and began his studies to receive his PhD in criminal justice at Washington State. It was July 9th is the first time that Bryan Kohberger's cell phone pings on King Road. And Thompson took a point to note that this is a densely populated area, and they can't prove exactly where he was or if 1122 King Road was where he intended to be. But his car was in that area on July 9th, and they have cell phone records that show he was there 23 times between July 9th and November 13th when the murder occurred. So that you might presume then that he was stalking one person or people inside that house or someone in that area. What they don't have, and this is, I think, the most frustrating thing for people who've been following this case, Thompson admits they have no evidence of any direct contact between Bryan Kohberger and any of the people who lived at 1122. Any of the Idaho 4 or the two other roommates who lived in that house. And I have a source who tells me that any reporting about him following one or more of the roommates on Instagram is not true. There isn't even a digital footprint of any kind of contact between Bryan Kohberger and the people in 1122 King Road. And that is frustrating. He's the only one who could tell us why he chose to go into that house that night on November 13th. And Thompson told us he went in through the kitchen sliding door, which we knew, and went to Maddie and Kaylee's room first, killed Maddie first, then Kaylee. And then Thompson admits they're not exactly sure of the timing of this, either on his way down or on his way out the door of the main floor of that house. He is confronted or bumps into Xana, who was the only person in that house who was still awake, kills Xana, then kills Ethan, who was still asleep in Xana's room. He also mentioned the testimony we would have heard from the surviving roommate who saw Kohberger through a crack in her door, and he mentioned that Kohberger was carrying a container. I had never heard that mentioned before, and he didn't elaborate on what size this container may have been or what they think may have been inside or if it had ever been recovered. And speaking of recovery, they never found the murder weapon, but they gave us a theory as to where they think it may have been. They have all of Kohberger's movements after the murders. They know that he went back to the house on King Road around 9 a.m. That would have been before 911 was called for, I think, about 20 minutes, he said, watching the house, we suppose. And then later on in the day, he went about, I think, 30 miles, he said, outside of town, outside from Moscow and Pullman, and went to the confluence of two rivers and was there for a time and then went back to his apartment. They're laying out a theory then that he would have thrown the murder weapon into those rivers. And then in the days and weeks afterwards, they have internet records showing that he searched for a new K-bar knife. Doesn't say whether or not he purchased a second knife, but then tried to clear his Amazon searches afterwards. And then he laid out a whole narrative of how Kohberger cleaned up his tracks. He talked about the arrest in Pennsylvania. He gave some acknowledgement to the FBI agents who and the Pennsylvania State Police troopers who were part of that arrest in Pennsylvania. They pulled DNA from the trash to confirm that the DNA in the knife sheath was Bryan Kohberger's. They also talked about his car, saying it was meticulously cleaned. There was cleaner next to it in the garage when they seized it at the house in Chestnut Hill Township. Bill Thompson actually said it was essentially disassembled from the inside, and just talked about how, no matter how clean your car is, there's still some dirt in it. It's almost impossible to have a perfectly clean car, and that Bryan Kohberger's was perfectly clean, and talked about how he had extensive knowledge of crime scene evidence collection because of his studies, and that he would have known had the knowledge and the skill to be able to clean his car of any evidence that they could have collected after seizing that car. Thompson then got emotional at the end of his statement when he went over again the names of the victims and what happened to them, and he dropped this bomb that I think has been floated out there before, but we haven't heard it from him, that they can't prove that Kohberger intended to kill all four. But that is what happened, regardless of what the intent was. And he got a little choked up talking about that. And then afterwards, we got to hear Bryan Kohberger say the words guilty 5 times when Hippler read through all of the charges against him. And now we look forward to sentencing. That will be the opportunity that the victims' families have to address Bryan Kohberger. He has a right to do what's called an allocution, which is when he gets to tell his side of the story. Whether or not he will do that, we don't know. He's not required to. So we will be we'll be standing by here on Case of Interest and on Newswatch 16 as more details come out. As always, thanks for watching.